start with the Minister. I want to let the committee know that we will take possibly a 10-minute break out as such for the Minister to have a bit of a break between the 2 hours, but during that time we'll continue on and do some committee business as we go. 2 hours until 4:25. We will. I'll start by welcoming Minister Laboutier back to committee again and the officials that are with her. And Minister, you have 5 minutes or less for your opening statement when you're ready.
Merci, merci beaucoup.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I'd like to first of all thank you for inviting me to appear before the committee to discuss a number of important issues. Before I begin, I'd like to point out that we are meeting on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin and Ishibek people. I'd like to begin by presenting the main estimates for 24-25 on behalf of Fisheries, Oceans, Canada, and the Canadian Coast Guard. Key in this area, we are looking for 506 million. We have it broken down in this fashion: 506 million for projects related to the Canadian Coast Guard fleet, including the acquisition of new vessels. 127.7 million for the signing of new collective agreements for employees. 52.7 million to continue our work under the Fisheries Act. And if you have any questions about my department's main estimates for 24-25, my department and my officials would be happy to do so after my presentation. That said, before I get to it, there are a few points I'd like to make. Let's start with the Embroidered fishery. As you know, last March I made a very difficult decision not to open the glass eel fishery in 2024 in the Maritimes. Since then, I'd like to remind you that anyone caught fishing for glass eels will be subject to enforcement action by fishery officers who are working with other agencies to combat the unauthorized fishing, sale, and possession of glass eels for export. Since the 6th of March, no fewer than 132 individuals have been arrested. 21 vehicles have been seized and forfeited, as well as 356 pounds of glass eel, 105 fake nets, and 249 landing nets. Whatever we say, I think the numbers speak for themselves. Fishery officers are out there. They're doing their jobs. They're patrolling rivers, facilities, and export points as we speak. The department is continuing to work to make the necessary regulatory and management changes in order to ensure a safe and sustainable glass eel fishery for all anglers. The fishery will only reopen or will not reopen until these measures are fully implemented, and we're working very hard to open the 2025 glass eel fishing season. I don't want the fishery to be closed for another year. Mr. Chair, last January I also authorized the reopening of a commercial redfish fishery in Unit 1 after a moratorium that lasted almost 3 decades. The final phase of the reopening of this fishery will last 2 years, so I'd like to take the opportunity to update you on the current status of this project. From the 4th to 7th of March, DFO held a series of productive meetings with the Rockfish Advisory Committee in Halifax. A number of important topics related to the sustainable management of this fishery were discussed during the meetings, in addition to key issues which will have impact on the next steps for this redfish sub-allocations. Feedback from the advisory committee members is currently helping to inform the decision on the Unit 1 Rockfish Management Plan for the 24 season. DFO is currently sharing its recommendations with me, and a decision will be communicated in the coming weeks prior to the opening of the rockfish season. At present, the earliest the fishery will be ready is June 15, after the annual redfish spawning season. In the meantime, since a test fishery is already underway, I have some excellent news to share with the members of this committee. In fact, as of this week, redfish caught in the St. Lawrence and processed in the Gaspésie can be found on the shelves of some 200 metro stores in Quebec. And that's just the beginning. Now is a time for us to get together and put our shoulder to the wheel, choose a redfish, put it on our plates, give it added value, and further develop the market. More recently, I tried it, and it's excellent, excellent. Also, I've had the pleasure of announcing the opening of a bait fishery, mackerel, of 470-ton personal use mackerel bait fishery. This announcement strikes the right balance between protecting the resource, equipping our fishermen with affordable bait, and obtaining recent data from the field or the sea, which can better inform future decisions on the fishery so vital to coastal communities. According to the president of the Maritime Fishers Union, we're even talking about savings of several thousands of dollars in bait for our fishermen, who will no longer have to indulge in the absurdity each season of buying the same mackerel but at much higher prices from the United States. In the medium term, DFO is firmly convinced that the Atlantic mackerel stock can rebuild, which is why I am more than ever determined to support the eventual reopening of the commercial Atlantic mackerel fishery. As you know, the Deputy Premier and Minister of Finance tabled in her latest budget on the 16th of April, and I'm delighted to see that it includes some excellent measures to support the fisheries sector, starting with a massive investment of nearly $500 million over 3 years, starting this year, to upgrade and maintain small craft harbors. As a nation with the longest coastline in the world, Canada has a duty to invest in resilient harbor infrastructures capable of meeting the climatic challenges of today and tomorrow. It's not only a question of economic development, but also of food security. Today, fish and seafood are among Canada's leading food exports. This means jobs for more than 45,000 Canadians and landings estimated at nearly $4.2 billion in 2022, and this is only for the commercial fishing industry. That's why once the 2024 budget is adopted, Fisheries and Oceans will work to identify the priorities of each region and will announce the allocation of the investment in due course. Next, on the EI front, the government plans to inject another $263.5 million, which will provide an extra 5 weeks of benefits to eligible seasonal workers in 13 economic regions in Atlantic Canada and Quebec, and this will go till 2026. As a proud representative of one of these 13 regions, I can tell you that this measure will make a huge difference for many of our workers who depend on those extra weeks to make the ends meet at the dawn of each tourist season. The 2024 budget also contains a number of investments which will help support our blue water economy. In addition to the financial support earmarked for small craft harbors, federal government will provide funds which to be shared among key departments, including Fisheries and Oceans Canada, Canadian Coast Guard, more than $1.6 billion to support the Canadian National Adaptation Strategy, which will help protect people and their communities from the effects of climate change. An investment of $25.1 million over 2 years for the Canadian shellfish sanitation program, and to help communities harvest shellfish safely for food, social, and ceremonial purposes, thereby contributing to their food security. $44 million will be devoted to programs that will enable Indigenous communities to continue to define common priorities. And finally, Mr. Chair, Budget 2024 includes an exciting measure to ease the tax burden of fishers. In short, with Budget 2024, we will be giving ourselves the means to achieve our ambitions by equipping our fishermen with the tools that they need and modern harbors for their children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, who will perpetuate our fine maritime traditions. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm now prepared to take questions from the members of the committee.
I'll go to our rounds of questioning, and I will let the members know that the Minister did go over a bit on our time, so we'll just add that on in the questioning as we go forward. You got time, have you? We'll now go to Mr. Small for 6 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to ask the Minister, Mr. Chair, if she's the Minister responsible for all of Canada's 950 small craft harbours.
Oui, je suis la ministre responsable des ports.
Yes, I am, in fact, responsible for small craft harbors.
How many projects do you have planned for the 2024-2025 season in small craft harbors across Canada?
L'exercice prévu pour 2024-2025.
The 24-25 fiscal year, I mentioned that first we have to adopt this budget formally in order to make the necessary investments in these small craft harbors.
Publication came from the DFO's website, and it outlines 41 projects for the upcoming year. How many of these 41 projects are in Liberal-held ridings? Minister?
Oui, la sous-ministre va pouvoir vous
You're the
répondre.
Minister. You had to sign
La
off on all
sous-ministre
these.
va pouvoir.
The Deputy Minister will respond to that question.
New of projects that for which we have money, and I think that's the list that you're referring to. As the Minister said, the new money in the budget, there needs to be an exercise to figure out the priorities for that. So
These projects are outlined. These harbours are here.
to start projects at the start of the year because there are things that need to be done immediately, and so that's what you're seeing.
So I think, I'm not sure, 37 of the 41 projects here are in Liberal-held ridings. That's quite the percentage. Minister, there's some harbours here that I'm not familiar with. I'm not sure which riding they're in. Maybe you might be able to help me out with some of these names you might be more familiar with. Milron? Do you know which riding that's in?
Ce que je tiens à vous dire, c'est que dans les priorités.
What I can tell you is in the small craft harbors that I mentioned, a very important priority for all of Canada. We know that these small craft harbors have been underfunded for a number of years, and we have to have the infrastructure which is going to allow our fishers to work safely throughout Canada.
Craft harbours, but I've got Milron, Point Bass. Do you know which riding that one's in?
Écoutez, il y a des ports pour petits bateaux.
Well, there are small craft harbors throughout Canada. These particular small craft harbors where the investment has been made, I can assure you that these are small craft harbors which are used by fishers and will help the economy.
Gardefoy, Grande Entrée, Gros Île, Île d'Entrée, Lons Beaufil, Pointe-à-Loup, Lons-Sabrion, Port Daniel East, Bonaventure. Where are all those ports located? Which riding, Minister?
Ben, je suis vraiment contente de pouvoir vous informer.
Well, I'm very pleased to inform you that Gaspésie and the Madeline Islands, which survives on fisheries, they've been receiving some investments, and it's been done in my sector as well as throughout the East Coast.
That's about to be added to your riding after the redistribution. Minister, 12 of the 41 projects scheduled for 2024-25 are in your riding. That's quite the percentage. For those who are missing out on funding for small craft harbours in their ports throughout Atlantic Canada and BC and the Great Lakes, what would you say to outside observers who might think that you've made partisan decisions here?
Écoutez, j'ai pris des décisions pour
I've taken decisions in order to ensure the benefit to fishers, to sharing of the economy throughout the area, and I'm doing it with integrity in the same fashion that I've been doing since my...
Are in your riding. 29% of all the Canadian projects.
Mr. Chair, point of order, please. Mr. Chair, with all due respect, I just would like to ask to please have my colleague and the minister to not be talking over each other with the microphones on. It's really challenging for the translators, so perhaps the chair could help everybody to be reminded of that. Thank you.
Yes, I will remind everybody, one person speaking at a time, and even if you're sat next to the person who's speaking, please don't be shouting or conversing with someone else around the table, because the mic picks it up and then the translators don't know which way they're supposed to translate, whether it's Mr. Small speaking or whether it's Mr. Perkins or Mr. Bragdon or Mr. Kellaway, whoever it is. Please, one at a time. That's all I ask. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Harbour Breton and Hermitage in my riding, and Shelburne and Pubnico in South and West Nova Scotia, each of these communities has a higher landed value in the fishery than all 12 of the riding or ports that are receiving funding. If you combine them all in the minister's riding, I wonder what the minister has to say to folks in the fishing industry in those harbours who didn't get a nickel. They're not projected to get a nickel in the upcoming year.
Yeah, unfortunately, Mr. Small, you're going way over time, so we'll go now to Mr. Hanley for 6 minutes or less, please.
Merci beaucoup. Merci, Ministre.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Madam Minister, for your appearance today and to spend 2 hours with us.
Questions in English for the benefit of my constituents for the most part. The first thing I'd like to talk about, especially in view of our ongoing study on the Yukon River salmon stocks, is some concern I have, and maybe you can alleviate my concern, but I noticed that in the main estimates, there's just over a $1 billion decrease in planned spending for the next 2 years, including, according to the department planning document, funding changes in planning for the Canadian Coast Guard, marine conservation targets, and the Pacific salmon strategy. So, of course, I'm concerned about the funding for the Pacific Salmon Strategy Initiative, and I wonder if you could clarify whether there is a determination to cut funding to the PSSI.
Je demanderais peut-être à M.
I might I would ask Mr. Henley to repeat his question because the DM didn't hear the question.
Funding and estimates for the Pacific Salmon Strategy Initiative, and if you could confirm or clarify if there's an intent to reduce funding for the PSSI.
The funding for the PSSI expires at the end of 25-26. It was a 5-year program, and so what happens after that is still to be decided. So there will be an evaluation of everything that's been done, and then determination on the next steps in that program and the funding levels. Right now, it was a B-based program, funding allocated over 5 years.
Okay, so really when it says planned changes in funding for the Pacific Salmon Strategy, that means the current funding commitment is intact, but there'll be some consideration of future funding. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yes, but I
Ms.
think
Givens,
another...
could I ask you not to be touching the...
Oh, sorry.
They hear the tapping on the...
Sorry.
Right.
Don't want to do anything to hurt the interpreters. There are also year-over-year changes in our programs where we may not spend as much as we thought in one year, and we'll reprofile it to the next year, or we may take money in one year and actually move it to an earlier year, depending on what we're seeing across the suite of programs. PSSI is a large, complex program with a lot of external partners, for example, and so we do move money across different elements and across fiscal years.
Okay, thank you. And finally, on that point, and perhaps for you again, Deputy Minister, and I know I've asked this before, but just clarification on how much of the PSSI is being directed towards projects along the Yukon River, and in view of, again, we know how clear the needs are for restoration of the salmon.
There is absolutely activity happening with respect to the Yukon River. I will have to return to you with an answer in writing on the specific amount.
I'd really appreciate that. I've also heard, and of course, the Minister and I have discussed how pleased we are with the recent 7-year moratorium on fishing as an international agreement between Alaska and Canada. I know that my constituents have really welcomed that. They've also pointed out that this is the beginning, and that the moratorium in itself will not be enough, and we certainly are hearing our witnesses encourage continued engagement with our partners in Alaska and also at federal level in the United States. And so I wonder whether you are formally engaged with counterparts in the U.S. federal government and government of Alaska on Yukon salmon, or whether this is being considered, and whether you think more formal engagement with all stakeholders is critical to moving forward on this issue.
Merci. Puis peut-être avant de passer...
Thank you very much. And before allowing the Deputy Minister to respond, I also admire the work that was done by Mr. Lay in a portfolio that's very, very important. The fisheries sector, of course, it's very important to be working collaboratively so that we can save wild salmon as well as the other indigenous species of fish in the area. I have had meetings in the United States with various partners in order to stress the work that we've been doing to protect these wild and native species.
That we absolutely work with the U.S. federal government and the state of Alaska. The state of Alaska has a lot of authorities with respect to salmon, but so does the U.S. Federal government, and we work with them in various venues, including the Pacific Salmon Commission, which is a very active forum for negotiations and joint work. And of course, we work intensively with Indigenous communities in the Yukon throughout BC on Pacific salmon issues as key partners.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hanley. You're right on time. We'll now go to, and I'll welcome Monsieur Blanchet-Janca, subbing in for Madame Debienne, who's the usual person from the block. You have 6 minutes or less, sir.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. Je salue les témoins qui sont...
Thank you very much, and I thank the witnesses with us before. I'm glad to see you, Madam Minister, and we also fish redfish in Rimouski, and we do get a good taste of it, and we process it in our area. My question is on the distribution of the quotas, the sub-allocation for redfish. You indicated the tonnage that was going to be allowed, and 58% is going to high seas speeds vessels, 100 feet length. How many of them are residents of your riding? The 25,000 tons is the minimum. It's the floor. There may be more. We're going to be discussing with the Redfish or Rockfish Advisory Council, and decisions will be arrived at shortly. I've made every effort to follow the recommendations of that advisory council, and 10% of the quota will be allocated to coastal fisheries. There's another portion that is cut out for the indigenous communities as by recommendation of the council. Well, if you're capturing, if you're fishing, for redfish or rockfish, you get bycatch as well. So we have to be careful of what we're doing there. Following the consultations that we've had, it was requested by the provinces to respect the historic allocations or quotas. These were respected, have been. Madam Minister, from your personal point of view, you're very familiar with these coastal communities. You've been in position since 2015, and you know that most of these boats, these ships, will be highliners going offshore. The owners, we can count them on the fingers of one hand, and from our area. It's not going to help the simple fishers who have simple needs, and they're obliged to go fishing for something else, shrimp, for example. We're helping the big players in the fisheries sector, and we are depriving those who will really depend on this to survive. Well, in Quebec, we don't have any major corporations in this sector. So we improved quite a bit over the traditional quotas. If you're talking about the Madeline Islands, for example, there's no intention whatsoever to build any new ships or vessels. They're prepared to work with indigenous communities, with Gaspésiens themselves, so that throughout Quebec, we're going to try to harvest our full quota. But the people are fishers are telling us that the traditional quota don't apply anymore. They're out of date. You're helping. You're not helping the communities that really need this as much as you could or should. So what led to that decision? It doesn't make any sense to me. Well, in the consultations that we've had across the country and in Quebec as well, they're not, we're not working on old data. We had consultations last year, and the advice was to maintain the traditional quota for redfish, which is what we did. For Nova Scotia, same thing, same message. Those that are working and bringing harvest to shore, they're making employment for the fish plants. The various associations that I work with, what I hear from them is that for once we have a minister who's willing to work with the fishing sector for the fishers. I think we're going ahead with that. Well, I thank you for your frankness. They're saying that in the Saint Laurent area, no one is the owner or an operator of a large ship over 100 feet in length, an offshore vessel. So the errors of the past, we're kind of repeating them. And these high seas offshore ships will be taking over in a few years. Can you assure us it won't happen? It's a fisheries based on quota allocations. Once you've captured all your quota, you're done for the season. You're done for the season. Well, do you have evidence that people actually don't overfish? Well, some of the recommendations that were proposed by the the advisory rockfish advisory committee of the Rockfish Association. And
It's over the 6-minute allotment. We'll now go to Ms. Barron for 6 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Minister, for being here, bienvenue, and to the other, of course, witnesses as well. Minister, just yesterday, actually, which was perfect timing, I met with representatives from EcoTrust, Coastal First Nations, UFAW, to talk about the necessary work towards a BC owner-operator licensing system. And as you know, our committee has completed 2 in-depth studies, one prior to my time, one during my time, that was unanimously recommending the implementation of a Made in BC owner-operator licensing regime. We also know that there's support from First Nations, broad support at First Nations, industry, communities for this change. We even saw the Premier of my home province, Premier Eby, write a letter to the Prime Minister, including you, urging the Government of Canada to work with the province of British Columbia to develop a Made in BC owner-operator licensing policy. Minister, we know what needs to be done, and my question to you is, when will you direct the department to end the delays and begin working with First Nations, industry, and the province to implement this long overdue policy reform?
Oui, puis écoutez, j'étais en décembre dernier.
well, last December I was in BC and I met with representatives of the fishing sector, operators, owners as well, and discussions have been undertaken to deal with the issue.
That's great that conversations are being had. Now, there's been a wealth of work that's already been done in this area. There's witnesses who came for the study that we did recently. There's recommendations from the 2019 report. There's endless testimony, information that shows the direction forward. It seems like there's a bit of a delay tactic happening here. Perhaps you can clarify. We know what needs to be done. We don't need to be asking the basic questions anymore. We need to be moving forward with action. When will those actions be taken?
Mais écoutez, ce que je peux vous dire, c'est que pour moi,
Well, what I can tell you, it'd be important not to try to start from square one once again. We have to take a look at what the committee has provided by way of information gathering and work. And it's at the level of negotiations, I think, that we will arrive means to promote the concept of owner-operator.
Continue with my questions, and perhaps if Ms. Gibbons would like to follow up some written information, that would be helpful. My last question in this section, Minister, is I'm wondering if you're waiting for permissions from the corporations and foreign owners that now control the licenses before you move forward with this desperately needed change.
non, écoutez, c'est pas du
No, that's not how I work. I don't wait for the approval or the approbation of the bigger corporations. Not at all. I work with those who are in the industry, fishers, to make progress in the area.
The diligence that you're wanting to take in making sure that you're getting it right, we know what needs to happen. So what I'm asking today, Minister, from so many who are relying on this change in the BC fisheries to be made to ensure that there is a fisheries for generations to come, that you move forward with the actions necessary and use the recommendations that have already been provided to do the work that's necessary.
Je veux vraiment vous rassurer que
Well, let me reassure you that I'm working on the principle that, as I mentioned in my presentation, that my children, my children's children, and their children will have access to the resource, and that we can make it sustainable and durable for the very long term. It's very important to try to work with the people who live by fishing to ensure that there will be fisheries and stock for years to come, decades to come. We are all impacted around the table as to the future of fisheries in this country. whether it's the East Coast with their various associations and federations, and the West Coast as well.
Set of questions, but just one last question around that. We know that that there are very different policies in place on the Atlantic coast. So why is it that it's good enough for us to move forward with policies that are putting the owners and local fishers at the forefront on the East Coast, but not on the West Coast?
Écoutez, je m'excuse, là, c'est parce qu'il y avait une difficulté au niveau de la traduction.
Okay, I was waiting on the translation. In order to, well, we work on both coasts, but there are First Nations, for example, on the East Coast, who actually travel to see how it's done on the West Coast. Methodology, aquaculture. There's a very big enthusiasm and interest to find modern solutions for the future. The fisher folk want to be part of the solution. They're anxious to do so. If you're working only for number one, you can work much more quickly and you don't have to have any particular policy. But if you want to sustain it for the long term, you have to collaborate.
For 5 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Minister and Department officials, for being here today. Minister, in your last appearance, you mentioned a meeting with the Ambassador of France and discussing a conference in Nice, France, in 2025. Do you recall that? I see you do. Okay, thank you. What is the ambassador's name?
Oui, effectivement. Oui, j'ai rencontré.
Yes, I did. The ambassador for France, I met with him. In 2025, there'll be a big meeting on the oceans.
Le nom de l'ambassadeur, je pourrais pas vous.
The ambassador's name? Not off the top of my head, no. But what was important was to add seals to the list.
Who's your counterpart in the United States federal cabinet?
Au niveau des noms, je pourrais pas vous le dire.
I'm not good with names, but I couldn't tell you. I don't know how that'll advance. That will make progress in the fishery sector. I met the American ambassador, the Japanese ambassador, but if you were to ask me the names of these individuals, I wouldn't be able to tell you.
Counterpart, and who's your point of contact?
Je pourrais pas vous le dire.
Couldn't tell you. But how does that advance progress in the fishery sector?
You are the key point for Canadian fisheries, and we are hearing coast to coast to coast issues that require international cooperation. If you haven't met your American counterpart or don't even recall their name, we have to question, why aren't you doing your job? Minister, I'm going to change topics slightly here. Of the $4.7 billion proposed for DFO in the main estimates for this year, how many dollars will support commercial fishing license and quota reform in British Columbia that this committee has repeatedly recommended changes to?
Pour le prochain budget?
In this current or upcoming budget, first we have to adopt the budget.
There's $4.7 billion proposed in this budget. How much of that is aimed to support commercial fishing license and quota reform in British Columbia? If you don't have it right now, we can wait for it in writing. My time is limited.
I can respond. The funding for for the moment, the activity that we're doing, as the minister said, is consultation. So we've certainly had the reports of the committee and
Just how much? Because we're talking main estimates.
so that would be operational budgets. So the staff that work on these issues. So
To us with how
they
much
would be
then,
people
please?
who are doing a lot of different fisheries activities, but
How much is targeted, if anything? Thank you, if you can provide that in writing. I'll move on now, Minister. When it comes to DFO science, are you aware of the 2023 report from the Commissioner of Environment and Sustainable Development that examines the department's monitoring of marine fisheries catch?
Écoutez, ce que je peux vous dire, c'est que dans les rencontres que j'ai eues avec les différents
In the meetings that I've had with the various associations, there's always discussions and concerns about the warming of the climate and whether it's for herring or mackerel.
Fisheries catch, the report on monitoring fisheries catch. Not climate change, not anything else, the monitoring of fisheries catch. Are you familiar with that report?
Oui.
Yes.
Thank you. In that report, the Commissioner made it clear that your department, continues to fail to monitor fisheries catch, and this causes a data gap for DFO science processes. Your own response to the committee's pinniped report states that there are science gaps for pinniped management. I cannot recall a single witness, Indigenous or non-Indigenous, who was not a DFO official, who has told this committee that DFO has adequate science. Minister, you previously told this committee that since coming to power, the government has rebuilt the confidence in science. Can you tell us who outside of DFO has confidence in DFO science?
I'm going to have to ask for that to come in writing, Mr. Arnold, as we're going over time. We'll now go to Mr. Cormier, who's online for 5 minutes or less, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. Welcome, Madam Minister. I would have liked to be with you in person today, but I can't. I almost fell off my chair when I heard the Conservatives talk about small craft harbors, and that have been so neglected under their regime. This is why we have perhaps more needs in some areas than others, because we were neglected throughout their administration. Now, the Conservatives are going to be opposed to this budget, but the Bloc Québécois was going to vote against some of these items on small craft harbors. What can we do? What more can we do with these investments? Yes, we have to increase our efforts in some areas to assist fisher folk with infrastructure repairs and what is going to be done with that money to help the fishers of our regions? Well, thank you very much. To me, it's a priority. Small craft harbors, with the damage caused by Fiona, we've been impacted very, very seriously. And we know that there's going to be more frequent storms, much stronger storms. And these small craft harbors becomes mini industrial zones. There's processing plants. We're going to have to dredge harbors. It's going to cost more. There are some harbors that need to be dredged 2 or 3 times a season. So we want to make sure that our fisher folk can carry out their profession in safety. We see that aboard any ship today, there's all sorts of technical equipment and gear, and this is very expensive. This is an economic issue there. Therefore, we have to work with the fishers, their port authority people as well, the administrators of these small craft harbors. We have to do better. We have to do more of investing in the small craft harbors. in order to allow that part of the fishing economy is viable. No, it's not only the general economy, it's also jobs and proper living for small communities. Direct economy, but there's a lot of spin-off from these investments. Well, thank you very much, Madam Minister. The fisher folk in my area in 2017 and 19, the increases were allowing them to do some supplementary projects, and we hope to get some more of that. A further question, I know that your questions have just asked you or mentioned seals. I know we know that there's a complete imbalance wherever we find seal and in the fisheries. We have to diminish the seal population and bring back a decent ratio. But I don't think there'll be a single association that will say, go ahead, let's slaughter some seals. That's what we want to do. No one is going to tell us that because there's dangers on the market. We might lose other valuable markets because we are, in fact, culling seals. What's your vision on this? Where are we going with initiatives or projects in the seal harvest? Well, I can tell you that a lot of work has been done in communities, particularly indigenous communities, who have taken the leadership in terms of seals and the economy of seals. It's not a matter of simply culling them, but we have to add value to the product and not just kill them off. And it's going to be very important to work with everything that we have in hand, including artificial intelligence and all the digital tools that we can handle. We want to have predictability of what is going on under the waves, in the sea. A lot is being done right now. And how we hope to intend that the fishing grounds have been very much appreciated by the sector. Work is being done to go to 2.0, or version 2.0, if you will, not the beta, with the technology. Whether we're talking about bycatch or quotas, we're trying to get a better predictability model of landings, harvest, because fish eat fish. And if we want to ensure the sustainability for the long term and allow, you have to allow enough for each species to survive, but we need to have the commercial value of fish first.
Junka, for 2.5 minutes or less, please.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. Je vais...
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Madam Minister, do you know that if you give 60% of the quota, we're talking redfish here, you're encouraging large corporations rather than smaller people in shrimp, for example, who have been abandoned. They need some support. Well, what I'm trying to get across is that coastal communities, coastal fishers, 10% has been guaranteed, set aside, cut out for indigenous fishermen. And it's a quota-based fishery. So you're entitled to catch the maximum of whatever you have as a quota. And this provides jobs in the processing plants locally. First, they fish, they have to ensure the ships, but mostly it's sort of processing lines there in the larger plants. But it's a smaller fishermen, the smaller boats. 70% of the quota is going to offshore large vessels. You're supposed to be working for the population and the fishermen in a region, not the corporations. We're setting aside quota for coastal fishing and indigenous communities. The high seas, the offshore fleets are people who live with us too. We're going to develop the entirety of the fishery. So you favor the larger corporations, Roger, the artisanal craft. Well, perhaps you're misreading my words or twisting them a little bit. We have preserved the quota traditionally offered in Quebec. That's what they was recommended. That's what we did.
Thank you, Chair. Minister, the Gitineau First Nation in British Columbia has been at the forefront of efforts in the region to secure a vibrant wild salmon future for the benefit of all. They're currently awaiting DFO approval for 2 initiatives. One, they've spent years negotiating a term sheet with DFO for Fisheries Reconciliation Agreement, for a DFO Fisheries Reconciliation Agreement. And the other one is they're awaiting funding for a conservation hatchery. Both these initiatives have been supported by the Regional Director General, but yet to have department approval come through. Minister, why the holdup, and when should the nation expect final approval?
I'm reluctant to touch it now. We have been negotiating with the Gitineau for some time now, and we expect to be in a position to advance in those negotiations very shortly. Yeah.
Thank you, Ms. Gibbons. Minister, DFO's Go Scare Fund ended on March the 31st, as you know, and groups who rely on this funding are extremely worried about the fact that no new funding has been allocated in Budget 2024. Can you clarify, has any new funding been allocated, and if not, when will it be?
Le fonds pour les engins fantômes a été.
Well, these ghost ships, the fund for the ghost ships has been very important. There's a lot of work that's being done in that matter. What's important, I think, is to ensure that we have a proper analysis of these particular ships, these phantom ships, and how we'll be able to, and the gear as well. We're trying to see if we can recuperate that stuff as well, so that we can salvage whatever we can find at seabed. It's part of the work that's being carried out over the next phases of the project.
It's good enough to understand. I realize it's not. So is the funding cut? Will we see funding? Just to clarify, will we see funding being allocated to the Go Scare Fund?
Well, it's a bit early to give you a stated number, but we have to analyze the project, and when we're prepared to receive requests or submissions, we're going to say, well, this is what our analysis has showed us, and this is what we think we should be doing. We'd like to know how we can involve fisher folk to participate. Don't forget that they all have a share in the responsibility of the good management of a fishery. In certain areas in my riding, we were able to salvage 800 lobster traps, for example. And that was only in one small part of my riding. You can imagine how much or how many you'd find, what kind of gear you could recapture or recuperate in Nova Scotia, for example. It's exponential. How can we involve fishers to get involved and there we can legitimately invest public funds and arrive at a circular economy and clean up the seabed as well.
The 10-minute break that the Minister requested, that gives 55 minutes on the dot in committee business or in public and camera, whichever way you want to look at it. So we'll allow the Minister now for a 10-minute break, and we'll reconvene again at 20 to 5, 4:40.